is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 18th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of October 12th, 2025. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to get in this week's podcast, and I am excited to get into it this week, but I think we have to first start on a little bit of a somber note. We had a fairly large global scientist pass away this last week of Jane Goodall, and I think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about that just to here at the beginning, because it actually will tie, I think, okay into what we're getting into this week. So Jane Goodall committed a major section of her life, starting at age 26, going into what is now Tanzania and studying chimpanzees. And her research is still continuing today, 50 years later, even though she is no longer, especially now, actively working on it. She was still part of it and people continuing what she was doing observations. One of the first people to recognize that chimps were utilizing tools, recognizing that they have feelings and kind of have their own kind of like family groups and inner fighting, and was one of the people who helped kind of have this way of showing the line between what we see as humanity and the wildness of nature blurring big time, and became a huge advocate for conservation, a huge advocate for specifically caring for our nature, caring for animals, and trying to say we shouldn't really necessarily be doing animal testing as little as possible, thinking about our environmental impact, trying to make sure that we're understanding how we are involved in this global thing. And while things are still difficult, one of the things that she was reiterated as I was kind of re-listening through different interviews this last week, hope. That no matter how hard things look, and maybe things are going toward the end of humanity, that it doesn't mean we quit. We should be going down swinging and really go and try and continue to provide that hope. One clip that I really wish I could re-find that I saw with her actually a few weeks ago that was awesome. It was a young girl talking about how she was inspired by Jane Goodall and what advice would she give her on how to prepare to become a scientist in the future. And Jane kind of goes through a few things, but then kind of wraps up with stating, remember, you can be a scientist today. Scientists are observations, and taking those observations, making notes, and then continuing to do that process, continuing to make sure and be present and observe what is going on around you. And that's one of her major things. When you look at her research of what she did with chimpanzees, it's the aspect of observation, her building cooperation with the chimpanzees, getting them to build trust with her, getting to be able to become kind of part of their group to some extent, getting this idea of how she isn't a threat. And this all took time and observation and taking notes, and then being able to, based off of what she was able to see, that look at how far and how much we can actually learn about chimpanzees and them being part of the great apes and how closely related chimps are to us. It's been a long ride, a good ride, and thank you so much, Jane Goodall, for all the amazing research on what you brought forward. Let's also quickly go into the question that we had for last week, which was, when was the last time you sat and listened and watched for God? And there was a great quote coming from one of our loyal listeners this last week of, God doesn't speak to me in a still small voice. It's usually a 2x4 alongside the head. And I think this is a great example for us on how often sometimes we go forward and keep persisting on doing something in this specific way or how we think it needs to be done. And sometimes God then says, what are you doing? And God then hits us with something totally different. I know in my life right now, one of the big things that I'm going through next week, I have the half marathon, and from various different circumstances, it's not going to be the race that I anticipated. I've been battling some injuries. I've been battling some flu bug stuff. My wife has been going through some of her own flu bug stuff. It's not the race that we had anticipated. But it's also, that isn't the point. The point wasn't for us necessarily to do it exactly the way that we were anticipating. The point for us is to do it and to finish. And there's various different reasons on why, and I'm not going to get into that today. But the aspect of sometimes when we picture and think of something in a specific way, that isn't necessarily always how God pictures it. And we need to be acknowledging of that. So let's just jump into it. One of the Old Testament texts this week is out of Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 1 and 4 through 7. This is now after Nebuchadnezzar has taken over the people of Israel. They have brought them into exile, and God is continuing to be with the people of Israel and is telling them, build homes, plant gardens where they eat and produce, take wives, take daughters, recognize that God is still in this place. God is still with you. God is going to continue to still in exile, in this place that's difficult and hard, that God's going to continue to prevail, even though it seems difficult and hard. And so that leads us then into Psalm 66, the first 12 verses of it. And this is then this recognition of the power of God and giving God then praise for that, recognizing that the whole earth worships God. And thus we should be able to acknowledge the amazing things of what God has done, and how this then needs to be part of who we are and just resounding through us so that we can be a testament to who God is. Recognizing that our praise is part of recognizing what God has done and being able to give praise to God for that and recognizing what a gift it is. The other Old Testament text you can choose from this week is from 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 to 3 and 7 through 15c. This is for an Old Testament text that's kind of in the middle of nowhere here in 2 Kings, is fairly familiar. We have Nahum, who is a commander of a controlling army of Aram, and he captures the Israel like we have had multiple times over. And he's this huge warrior, but he has this skin disease. And part of the capturing, he ends up having this servant girl who is from Israel, talking about, if you were listening to the prophets or listen to the prophets that I would have, they would be able to heal you. And so some of the verses that we get missed here are writing and talking about it, and he ends up going to Elisha. And Elisha is not real pleased with this news initially, that God's saying, yes, go and listen to this man, have him come and see you. And Elisha's like, okay, God, I really don't want to do this. He comes, and Elisha says, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times and your flesh will be restored. This gets Nahum pretty upset in the aspect of, why are you having me come all this way? There's so many other rivers that I could have gone and done this in. Why do I have to go to the dirty Jordan to do this? And it's one of his servants that kind of says, if it was more difficult, would you have still complained in the same way? This isn't that difficult. Why don't you go and do it? And he goes and does it, and boom, his skin is clean. And then it's this aspect of, now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. This then leads us to Psalm 111, all 10 verses of it. And again, this would be a praise psalm, praising the majesty, the honor, recognizing that God is this provider, recognizing that he is the one that is making sure all of this happens, and that this is us to have the healthy fear, but it's also in that fear of the Lord, we can then pursue and seek the wisdom that the Lord is trying to give us to learn. So this idea then that we have to recognize the amazing things that God has done, but then also give praise and alms to God in recognizing that because God is so powerful and mighty, that there is this fear of God, a healthy fear of God, that also gives us the insight into wisdom. The epistle text this week, or second reading, is from 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 15. And this is then this reminder that Christ died for us and suffered hardships on our behalf and endured all of this so that we are able to obtain eternal life because of what Christ did and because of what that is. That should be something that then we go out and proclaim. This is then something that should change how we live. This should be something that acknowledges that we are not the same, that our world and how we look at the world should change based off of this, and recognizing that this is a gift from God, and thus we should be living our lives in a way that we are giving praise and thanks to God for that gift, and acknowledging that gift and living that out. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 17, starting in verse 11 through 19. This is where Jesus then is on his way to Jerusalem, passing through Samaria and Galilee, and there are some sick people in this village. And Jesus has mercy on them and says to go and show yourselves to the priest, and they will make you clean. And while they are on the way, they are healed. And of the 10, one returns. And Jesus then is asking, where are these other 9? And of the one who returned is a Samaritan on top of it. And Jesus then is just kind of questioning and recognizing it's the foreigner in this case, is the one who recognizes the gift and comes back and thanks for the gift. And in this case, then Jesus finally then responds with, get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well. This recognition of the believing and recognizing what God can do, but then also still going back and giving praise and thanks to God for what God has done. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts or commentaries or discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and direction and ways to be thinking about and looking at these texts. It's a great resource over there with a lot of great things to be looking at, different texts, different ideas, different ways of approaching these texts. So if you haven't checked workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but they also have art, which can be extremely helpful to get some different perspectives and ways of looking at these texts, prayers, hymns, colors, other daily readings to help you get into these texts and prepare. Remember, the more we're in these texts, the more you're able to extract from these texts, the more you're able to actually get out of a sermon or getting out of a worship service just in general because of the preparation that you have done. So I'd highly recommend checking out Vanderbilt's Revised Common Lectionary coming from their Divinity Library. I really enjoy it week to week, and I'd highly recommend that you check it out as well. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies in the weekly preaching, along with some different events and occasional ways to be thinking about things in a more ecological sense. So if you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy the resources over there at Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication, and I'll be the first link down in the references section of the show notes. What does it really mean for us to give thanks? What does that mean? Especially in the world in which we're in, do we really think about that well? Especially when I am thinking about food, there is so many steps between me and where the food came from that it's easy for me to feel like I can't really give thanks because my thanks is to the person who stocked it at the grocery store. They're not really the one who did the work. And also for me, growing up in rural Wisconsin and growing up around a lot of farmers, one of the things that I have found is that farmers are one of the most trusting people that I have ever met, typically. Because how farming works is that you can have all the things set up well, and there's still things out of their control that they cannot control. Especially if they have huge swaths of fields, they're dependent on having pollinators come in, they're dependent on the rain coming. They can do things, they can help give fertilizer, but if there isn't the rain to come, it doesn't matter. The fields just aren't going to grow. And I think this is one of the things for us, especially in this industrialized world in which we're in, it's really easy for us to forget about. If I need a tomato in January, I go to the grocery store, I don't think about where that tomato necessarily is coming from. And especially here in the Northern Hemisphere, as we are starting to move into the fall season, I think in this harvest time, it is recognizing what it all takes for that harvest. One of the major aspects to it is, like I stated, pollinators. Now, what are pollinators? Pollinators are insects that go in and help be able to knock the pollen off the plant and being able to bring it to the next plant, and thus being able to help in the reproduction process and bringing the male and female parts together in order for crops to grow. in that there is a beneficial relationship that helps specifically like honeybees, being able to help them be able to make honey, but it's also providing the nectar and the sweetness that a lot of these insects are needing in order for them to be able to survive. And we have also talked about on this podcast plenty of times before how there are specific insects that are grown this beautiful relationship back and forth, that specific plants are looking for specific insects so that they can pollinate each other and have this mutualistic relationship where both are benefiting. It's beautiful. But it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of trust. If suddenly those weren't there, the whole thing falls apart. And that's why there has been such a push, at least here in the United States, talking about save the bees, save the pollinators, doing pollinator gardens. Heck, I even have one just outside the window here that my wife and I have planted to help with having the pollinators have a sacred place to be. But I also think about like what we were talking a little bit about in the introduction of like Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall had this vision as a young child, had this vision that she wanted to go to Africa. She wanted to be around wild animals. She got around chimpanzees, and it took her years to build the trust of them to be able to trust her. Her doing processes day after day after day after day, and finally getting to the point where they trusted her. And in doing that, enveloping her into their community so that she was able to learn more about them. And thus, arguably, because of how close genetically we are to chimpanzees, helping us learn more about human beings as a whole. This took patience. This took a lot of work. It was something that she dedicated basically a good section of her life to. And one of the things that she keeps talking about now, even from beyond the grave, of how we have to still think about our relationship with the planet as part of this. I think a lot of times within the world in which we're in, it's very easy for us to get caught up in, okay, I fixed this and move on to the next thing. But are we going back and ever really truly giving thanks? How often are we really truly giving thanks to the people who are putting in the work, the effort, and likewise to be able to help make sure that the world is fed? And I know there's a whole discussion there on how we still have a long way to go to be able to make sure that the world is actually fed, even though we produce plenty of food to do that. But how often do we actually really truly give thanks to the people who are making sure that we are fed? Do we? Do we really do that? Do we really spend that time? And I think part of it is because of how far removed we have gotten from it, somewhat on purpose because of industrialization, but somewhat also because then we don't sit and actually think about this. We don't sit and think about the process on how rains needed to come. You still needed to have somebody tend to the garden, no matter how big or small the garden was, to watch for weeds or help spread fertilizer, or all the different processes of being able to help a plant grow. Planting the right plants in the areas that their pollinators are going to be there to be able to help these plants be able to grow. Heck, we know of even in different parts of the country where we'll bring in bees at different parts of the year to help like almond farmers be able to have enough pollination for their plants to be able to produce the amount of almonds that we're wanting to produce for us to consume. And this brings me back to the aspect of the faith of the farmer, just in general, about how they have to have faith that I'm planting the seed, I'm going to put in the work as much as I can, and I still have to have things that are beyond my control go my way. I can bring in some pollinators, but are they going to cover all my plants? I can fertilize, but depending on how big your fields are, you can't necessarily water, or the water bill would be astronomical and there wouldn't be enough water for other people. You have to trust that God's going to still provide. And I think that's the aspect of, yes, us doing grace and thanking God for the food, but do we ever trace it back and think about the people who have put in the time, the work, and the effort in order for that food to be there in front of you? If we aren't spending the time thinking about and recognizing that and acknowledging that, I don't think we're any different than the other 9. One of the amazing things as we sit and we think about the impact of what Jane Goodall was able to have and what she has talked about is the aspect that we have to acknowledge our impact on the planet. We have to acknowledge things outside of ourselves, outside of our species, and acknowledge the impact of what that can be, not only for these other species, but also how it comes back to us. And I think that's one of the things that isn't talked about directly here in this text, but it's hinted at. When Jesus says, get up and go on your way, your faith has made you well. The faith of acknowledging the process of what has happened to get them to that point of being healed. And it is worth going back and acknowledging that. 2 Timothy talking about, okay, yes, what Christ did for you was not for Christ, it was for you. So have your life reflect in a way so that others can tell that you have been impacted and changed by this. Acknowledge that impact. We have 2 Psalms this week giving praise and recognizing the power of who God is. We have Nahum talk about a person who is frustrated, trying to do this all on his own. Why can't I just wash in these other rivers? And then acknowledging after going through the process what God is doing. And even in the Jeremiah text this week, after being captured, after being in exile, what happens? Still go and build, still plant gardens. Even though that you went the wrong way, God is still there. Acknowledge it. This process, and especially I think in the world in which we're in the 21st century now, is acknowledging the aspect of, yes, God is in control, but also recognizing the process of how God works in and amongst all of our lives to work together, and acknowledging the aspect of God's character outside of the human experience. We need to acknowledge that outside of the human experience, we can also see God. We can also learn about God. And the faster that we learn that, and the sooner that we acknowledge that, the sooner that we're able to see, like Jane Goodall, and how these things come together and how whole environments and ecosystems impact a group of chimpanzees or impact us, the better off we're going to be. The faster that we can acknowledge within whole food systems how there are things that are outside of our control that we still need to give thanks to. This idea that, oh, these insects are annoying and so I'm just going to spray and take care of them, not recognizing that those also might be the same insects that you are dependent on for having food on your table. We have to be able to break some of these chains and acknowledge the whole process. And part of what industrialization has done, unfortunately, is it's breaking that up and making it harder for us to be able to see these connections. So we have to force ourselves to put ourselves in positions to see these connections. I would argue that one of the things that has been scary within my lifetime is I'm seeing a world that is trying to go, at least here in the United States, more and more individualistic, more and more tighten up by the bootstraps, you can do it yourself. And the thing that's frustrating and hard for me with that is the aspect of when I look out in nature and I look at the rest of God's creation, that's not how it works. And if I'm being truly honest with myself, to the position and places where I am at professionally, spiritually, emotionally, none of them I have done myself. So why the heck do I suddenly think that my whole life needs to be individualistic? The scary thing is if I do see this life individualistic, I am no better than those 9 that continue walking and saying, it is me that suddenly healed myself. And I never go back and think. Part of the thinking is the humbling of oneself. And if we talk about humbling ourselves in front of the throne, humbling ourselves in front of God, we gosh darn better be practicing now and recognizing how many things are outside of our control that God has in God's hands and is trying to give us these gifts, and thus we need to give thanks to them. So the question I have for you this week is, where do you need to give thanks? Where do you need to give thanks? As frustrating for me personally as the half marathon I'm about to do and how it's not going to be the way that I anticipate, there is still so many things that I have to give thanks to God about. That I have been able to do training runs knowing that I'm able to do it. That my body for the most part has been able to do it, though now there's a few things that they aren't going to be working the way that I hoped they would be. They just aren't. But it's amazing still what my body is able to do. The amazing things of what my body is able to overcome, and that is a gift from God, recognizing what God has been able to construct for our bodies to be able to overcome. Looking at the support systems that are around me, looking at things beyond my control, the trails, the roads, all the different places that people have created so that I was able to train easily and safely. To the people who are able to create the shoes, the clothing, the different things to enable me to be able to sweat easier, to run faster, to have more spring in my step, to the different training gear to help with calf strains and all the different healing and ice and all these different things, energy gels and energy packets to take on the race, the water stops and medical tents that will be along the route. All these things are worthy of thanks. Just in one race, are we truly recognizing this, bringing this before God and thanking God for these things? Are we truly looking at the beautiful things of what God has done within God's creation for us? Especially on whether you are in the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere, you are on a shoulder season. You are seeing the miracle of all these things changing. Are we giving thanks to that? Are we giving thanks to the recognition here in the northern hemisphere that we have plants being able to say it's okay to take a break? That God has designed in a break? Are we giving thanks for that? I think these are things that we need to be contemplating and looking at and considering more. Because I think when we slow down and actually look at this, we start getting closer to what I would say is God's time. Because I don't think that we as humans typically run on the same time span that God does in the aspect of how God moves. I feel God at times moves a little bit slower and more deliberately than we do. And I think sometimes going through the process of giving thanks slows us down to get closer to that tempo, closer to that pace, closer to recognizing the beauty of what God is doing. And in doing that, we then, I feel, get closer to what God is calling us to be, easier for us to listen, as we talked about last week, easier for us to acknowledge what God is doing and giving thanks to that. And that is something that is worth our time, it's worth our effort, and it's worth acknowledging how amazing of what God is doing for us. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.